The dust of the main street settled in thin, pale layers on everything, coating the warped boards of the general store's porch and dulling the shine on the glass of its large front window. Inside, the air hung thick with the competing scents of milled flour, cured tobacco, and brittle dry goods cloth. Thomas moved through this haze with a practiced economy of motion, his presence as worn and quiet as the leather of his boots. His daughter Clara followed a step behind, her gaze fixed on the list clutched in her hand, a small shield against the world. They were a study in faded brown and gray, their clothes mended until the patches themselves were worn thin, their faces etched with the signature of sun and hardship. They did not speak, for the list was short and their needs were simple, a language they both understood without words. Two women stood by the bolt of calico, their laughter a sharp, bright sound in the afternoon quiet. Mrs. Gable, whose husband owned the bank, fanned herself with a lace-edged handkerchief, her rings catching the light. Mrs. Hemlock, the mayor's wife, adjusted a hat adorned with a feather that seemed too ostentatious for the grit of the town. Their eyes slid over to Thomas as he placed a sack of flour on the counter, the movement slow and deliberate, as if conserving a finite reserve of energy. "Goodness," Mrs. Gable whispered, loud enough to carry across the floorboards. "You'd think he could afford a new shirt. That one is more whole than cotton." Mrs. Hemlock tittered. "The dirt holds it together, I imagine. And the daughter, always with her head down. It's a shame, really. Such a plain thing." Thomas's shoulders tightened, a barely perceptible ripple of muscle beneath the frayed fabric. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge them. His world had shrunk to the space between himself and the storekeeper, a small island of necessary transaction. Clara's knuckles went white where she gripped her list. In the corner of the store, almost lost in the shadows cast by shelves stacked high with tins and jars, a woman stood observing. She was a silent figure of profound stillness, dressed in a gown of dark green silk that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Her hair was coiled in an intricate, severe knot, and her face, though unlined, held a history that defied the town's simple narratives. This was Mrs. Lee, the widow of the man who had built a small fortune on the railroad and then left it all to her. She was a ghost in the town's social fabric, seen but never truly known, her wealth a barrier as formidable as any fence. She watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. She noted the rigid line of Thomas's back, the tremor in his daughter's hand, the casual cruelty of the other women. After the storekeeper tallied the meager purchase, Thomas counted out the coins with painstaking care. As he turned to leave, the store fell into an even deeper silence. Mrs. Lee stepped forward from the shadows, her silk dress whispering against the floor. She stopped directly in his path, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her eyes were dark and steady. The air grew tight, charged with the weight of the unspoken. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hemlock froze, their amusement turning to baffled curiosity. Mrs. Lee's voice, when it came, was clear and devoid of inflection, a smooth stone dropped into a still pond. "Mr. Alden," she said, her use of his name a small shock in itself. "Are you looking for a wife?" The question hung in the thick air, a thing with shape and weight. It silenced the rustle of Mrs. Gable's fan and the creak of the floorboards under the storekeeper's feet. For a long, stretched moment, Thomas did not move, did not breathe. He felt the heat rise in his neck, a flush of shame and confusion so potent it was dizzying. Behind him he could feel the sharpened focus of the two women, their scorn momentarily replaced by a predatory intrigue. Clara's hand found the crook of his elbow, a small, anchoring touch in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. He finally looked at Mrs. Lee, truly looked at her. He saw not the exotic caricature the town whispered about, but a woman whose composure was a fortress built of unknown sorrows. There was no mockery in her eyes, only a calm, unnerving sincerity. He had no answer. The words did not exist. He gave a short, jerky nod that was meant as a dismissal, a gesture to clear the path, and steered Clara toward the door. The bell above it gave a flat, tinny jangle as they stepped out into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The walk to their horse, tied to a hitching post down the street, was the longest of his life. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. Every shadow seemed to stretch and point. He did not speak, and Clara, wise beyond her years, did not press him. She simply walked beside him, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the ringing in his ears. The silence held for the entire ride back to the farm, a long, dusty trail that wound away from the town and into the unforgiving embrace of the foothills. The sun beat down, baking the hard-packed earth and wilting the sparse vegetation that clung to life along the road. Thomas's hands, calloused and cracked, held the reins loosely, his knuckles white. He was a man who lived his life within carefully constructed walls of routine and resignation. He rose with the sun, worked the stubborn soil until his muscles screamed, ate a spare meal, and fell into an exhausted sleep, only to repeat the cycle. It was a life of grim necessity, and he had long ago made a bitter peace with it. Mrs. Lee's question had breached those walls. It was a stone thrown not at his fortress, but through a window he had forgotten was even there. It was an impossible, ludicrous question, and yet it had unsettled him more than any drought or failed crop. He could still see her standing there, a figure of dark green silk against the store's drab interior, her gaze direct and unwavering. He felt like a specimen under glass, his poverty and his solitude laid bare for all to see, and then, inexplicably, assessed for a purpose he could not begin to comprehend. He was a poor farmer, she was a rich widow. The chasm between their worlds was as wide and deep as the canyons that cut through the distant mountains. The farm was less a place of cultivation than a testament to stubborn persistence. The house, a small, unpainted structure, leaned slightly, as if tired of its long battle against the wind. The fields were patches of pale, thirsty soil where crops struggled for purchase, their growth a daily uncertainty. A few chickens scratched in the dirt near a weathered coop, and in a small fenced paddock a single, aging horse flicked its tail at the persistent flies. This was Thomas's inheritance, a legacy of toil passed down from his father, a piece of land that gave just enough to keep a man from starving, but never enough to let him dream. He and Clara worked until the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor. They moved the water troughs, mended a section of fence, and cleared stones from a new plot, their silence a comfortable habit. It was only later, sitting on the porch as the sky bled from orange to a deep, bruised purple, that the silence was finally broken. Clara sat on the top step, hugging her knees, her gaze lost in the vast, darkening expanse. "She wasn't making fun of you," she said softly, not looking at him. Thomas stopped cleaning a piece of tack, his hands stilling. "What?" "In the store. Mrs. Lie." Clara turned her head, her expression serious. The other two were, but she wasn't. Her eyes were quiet. He resumed his work, his motions stiff. "It was a joke, a rich woman's cruel joke." "I don't think so," Clara insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of conviction. "It wasn't a joke. It was a question." He set the leather strap down with a sigh, the sound lost in the chirping of the first crickets. He looked at his daughter, at the faint lines of worry that were already beginning to form around her eyes, and a familiar ache settled in his chest. He had wanted more for her than this life of endless work and quiet desperation. He had wanted her to have the softness and laughter her mother had possessed, a memory that was now as faded and distant as an old photograph. His wife, Mary, had been the light of this place. She had seen potential in the barren soil and beauty in the harsh sunsets. When he had lost her to a fever that swept through the valley 5 years prior, the light had gone out, leaving him in this perpetual twilight of survival. "What could she possibly want with a man like me?" he asked, the question directed more at the encroaching night than at his daughter. "We have nothing." "Maybe," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper, "she doesn't want anything. Maybe she has everything she wants, except something else." Thomas had no answer for that. He had spent 5 years turning away from the world, from the pitying glances of his neighbors, from the hollow space in his bed. He had fortified himself against hope, because hope was a dangerous thing. It demanded energy he did not have, and promised a future he could not envision. Mrs. Lee's question, however, had planted a seed in the barren ground of his heart, and he was terrified to see what might grow. Mrs. Lee's house sat on a low rise overlooking the town, set back from the main road by a long gravel drive. It was not a mansion, but it was built of sturdy timber and river stone, with wide windows and a deep shaded porch that ran the length of the front. A garden, a riot of green in the parched landscape, was meticulously tended by a hired hand. Inside, the rooms were cool and dark, filled with furniture of polished dark wood and objects that spoke of a different world, porcelain vases painted with delicate scenes, silk screens that partitioned the space, and a lingering, subtle scent of sandalwood and tea. She moved through these rooms with a grace that seemed at odds with the ruggedness of the land outside. Her life, like Thomas's, was one of routine, but of a different sort. Her days were marked by the quiet turning of pages, the careful brewing of tea, the writing of letters in a language no one else in town could read. She was an island of elegant solitude. Her late husband, a man of great ambition and surprising gentleness, had brought her to this country and built this house for her. He had shielded her from the town's suspicion and prejudice with the sheer force of his influence and wealth. When he died, the influence remained, but the shield was gone. She was left with his fortune and his name, a respected but fundamentally alien presence. The townspeople treated her with a formal, distant courtesy. They did business with her, sought her for loans, but never invited her into their homes. They saw the silk and the porcelain. They did not see the woman who walked the silent halls, a stranger in a strange land. Her question to Thomas Alden had not been an impulse. It had been a calculated decision, born of long, quiet observation. She had seen him in town for years, a man weathered into a kind of quiet nobility by his struggles. She saw the way he protected his daughter, the stoic set of his jaw in the face of public indignity, the honesty in his worn hands as he counted out his few coins. He was, she had concluded, a man of substance, a man whose character was as solid and unyielding as the rocky soil he worked. She was pragmatic. She was lonely, but she was not seeking a grand passion. She was seeking a partnership. She needed an anchor in this community, a man who understood the land, a presence to fill the echoing silence of her home. He needed, well, his needs were written on his face, in the fray of his collar, in the tired slump of his shoulders. It could be a simple, respectable transaction, a merging of assets. She would provide financial stability, a life free from the constant, grinding worry of poverty. He would provide companionship, a shared existence, a buffer against the world. It was a logical, sensible arrangement, and yet, as she sat on her porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, she admitted to herself a less practical truth. There was something in his eyes, a deep, banked sorrow that she recognized, for she carried a version of it in her own heart. Perhaps, she thought, two broken things, when set side by side, could lean against each other and create a kind of strength. A week passed. The sun rose and set, the heat shimmered over the fields, and the memory of the general store began to feel like a strange, unsettling dream. Thomas worked relentlessly, trying to sweat the encounter out of his system, but the question lingered at the edges of his thoughts, a persistent, low hum. He caught Clara watching him, her gaze full of unspoken questions. He saw the new tear in her only good dress and the worn soles of her shoes. He looked at his own reflection in the murky water of the wash basin, a gaunt, tired man, older than his 40 years. The thought of accepting charity was a bitter pill, a surrender he had sworn he would never make. But this was not charity. It was a proposal, however unorthodox. It was a door opening into a world he could not imagine, and his pride was a poor trade for his daughter's future. One evening, after a day of back-breaking labor that had yielded little more than dust and sweat, he made a decision. He washed his face, put on his least worn shirt, and brushed the dirt from his boots. "I'm going out," he said, his voice rough. Clara looked up from her mending, her eyes wide with surprise. He never went out after dark. "Where?" He didn't answer immediately, just stared out the open doorway at the first stars pricking the velvet sky. "To see Mrs. Lee." He walked the 2 miles to her house, the road a pale ribbon under the moonlight. Each step was a battle between his pride and his desperation. By the time he reached the gravel drive, he had almost turned back a dozen times. A soft light glowed from the windows of her house, a warm beacon in the vast darkness. She was sitting on the porch, as if she had been expecting him. A single lantern cast a gentle circle of light around her, leaving the rest of the porch in deep shadow. She did not seem surprised to see him emerge from the night, a dusty, hesitant figure. She simply gestured to a rocking chair opposite hers. "Mr. Alden," she said, her voice as calm as it had been in the store. He stood awkwardly for a moment before sitting, the chair groaning under his weight. He placed his hands on his knees, unsure of what to do with them. They looked large and clumsy in the soft light. "Ma'am," he managed, the word feeling inadequate. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the whisper of a breeze through the leaves of the cottonwood trees that shaded the house. He had prepared a speech on the walk over, a clumsy explanation of his circumstances, but the words died in his throat. In her serene presence, they felt like excuses. She seemed to understand. She did not press him for an answer. Instead, she rose and went inside, returning a few moments later with 2 glasses of cool water. She handed one to him, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough against hers. "The nights are growing cooler," she said, her gaze on the distant horizon. "A good sign." "It is," he agreed, his voice tight. He took a sip of the water. It was the coldest, cleanest water he had tasted in years. "My well is running low." It was a simple statement of fact, but in that quiet space it felt like a confession. She nodded slowly, her eyes still on the darkness. "Water is life here." Another silence fell, but this one felt different. It was less a void and more a space for listening. He was no longer just a poor farmer on a rich woman's porch. He was a man, and she was a woman, and they were 2 solitary souls sitting together in the vast, lonely dark of the West. The sight of Thomas Alden's horse tied outside Mrs. Lee's house for a second, and then a third time in as many weeks, did not go unnoticed. The town of Redemption was a place where secrets had a short lifespan, and gossip was the primary currency of social exchange. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hemlock, holding court on the mercantile porch, dissected the development with the precision of surgeons. "Can you imagine the nerve?" Mrs. Hemlock declared, snapping her fan shut for emphasis. "He walks in there bold as brass, after she made a public spectacle of him." "It's not nerve, my dear, it's desperation," Mrs. Gable corrected, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "He's a pauper, and she's swimming in her late husband's money. It's a transaction, plain and simple. He's selling himself." A murmur of agreement went through the small circle of women gathered around them. The narrative was simple, clean, and satisfyingly scandalous. The poor, proud farmer, finally brought to his knees. The strange, foreign widow, buying herself a husband as one might buy a new horse. Thomas felt the shift in the town's atmosphere almost immediately. The usual mixture of pity and disregard he received was replaced by something sharper, a blend of contempt and prurient curiosity. When he went for supplies, conversations would halt as he entered a room. Eyes would follow him down the street. He felt their judgment like a physical weight, a brand on his skin. He had spent his life being invisible, and he found, to his surprise, that he preferred it to this sudden, unwelcome visibility. The whispers followed him home, echoing in the quiet of his own mind. Was that what this was? Was he selling himself? The thought filled him with a familiar, suffocating shame. He began to doubt his decision, to question the quiet understanding he thought he was building with Mrs. Lee. Their meetings on her porch were islands of tranquility in his turbulent world. They rarely spoke of her proposal. Instead, they talked of the weather, of the price of grain, of the stubbornness of the soil. He found himself speaking of his wife Mary for the first time in years, not of the sickness that took her, but of the way she could identify wildflowers or the sound of her laugh. In return, Mrs. Lee spoke of the city she came from, a place of bustling rivers and green mountains, so different from this arid land. She described her husband not as the tycoon the town knew, but as a man who had loved poetry and the quiet ritual of drinking tea. They were circling each other's solitude, finding points of common ground in their shared histories of loss. But the town's judgment was a poison that seeped into these quiet moments. He started to feel like an actor in a play he hadn't written, his every move scrutinized and misinterpreted. One afternoon, he almost turned his horse around on the way to her house, the weight of it all too much to bear. He was a simple man. He wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his work and his grief. This arrangement, this strange courtship, had dragged him into the light, and he was not sure he could withstand the glare. The invitation was delivered by Mrs. Lee's hired hand, a quiet man named Samuel, who tipped his hat and left without a word. It was a simple, handwritten note on fine cream-colored paper, requesting the presence of Mr. Alden and his daughter for supper the following evening. The formality of it felt both kind and daunting. For Clara, it was a source of breathless excitement. She spent the entire next day washing and pressing their best clothes, which were still worn but now impeccably clean. She even tried to arrange her hair in a more fashionable style, her face a mask of concentration in their small, cracked mirror. For Thomas, the invitation was another hurdle. A meal inside her house felt like a significant escalation, a step across a threshold from which there might be no return. It felt public, official, a confirmation of the town's ugliest rumors. Yet he could not deny the flicker of anticipation, the thought of a meal he did not have to cook, of a conversation that did not revolve around the endless cycle of farm work. When they arrived, Mrs. Lee greeted them at the door. She was not wearing her formal silk, but a simpler dress of deep blue cotton. She led them not into a grand dining room, but to a small round table in an alcove overlooking her garden. The setting sun cast long golden rays through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The meal was simple but elegant. There was a roasted chicken, vegetables from her garden, and fresh bread that was still warm. For Thomas and Clara, who were accustomed to a diet of beans, potatoes, and occasional salt pork, it was a feast. At first the conversation was stilted. Thomas felt clumsy and out of place, his large, work-roughened hands looking alien against the delicate porcelain plate. Clara was shy, her answers to Mrs. Lee's gentle questions short and whispered. But Mrs. Lee was a patient hostess. She did not force the conversation. She spoke about her garden, asking Thomas for his advice on protecting her tomato plants from blight. The question was a masterful stroke of diplomacy. It placed him in the position of an expert, giving him a foothold of confidence. He found himself talking about soil composition and watering schedules, his voice losing its tight, cautious edge. He was on familiar ground. Clara, seeing her father relax, began to open up as well. She spoke of her mother's flower patch, a small corner of the farm she still tried to tend, and Mrs. Lee listened with genuine interest. "Your mother must have been a woman who loved beautiful things," Mrs. Lee said, her gaze soft. "She was," Clara whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. "She made this whole place feel beautiful." As the evening wore on, the tension slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet, tentative warmth. They were no longer a rich widow and a poor farmer. They were three people sharing a meal, their solitude momentarily eased by the simple act of breaking bread together. When Thomas and Clara left later that night, walking under a brilliant canopy of stars, the silence between them was different. It was not the heavy, anxious silence of the past weeks, but a light, thoughtful one. "She has kind eyes," Clara said finally. Thomas nodded, his gaze on the path ahead. "Yes," he said, "she does." He felt a subtle shift inside him, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even realized was there. The town could whisper all it wanted. In the warm glow of Mrs. Lee's home, he had felt something that had been absent from his life for a very long time, a glimmer of peace. The first hint of trouble came not as a storm, but as a slow, creeping sickness in the earth. The well, which had sustained the Alden farm for 2 generations, began to falter. The water that came up was thin and murky, the bucket taking longer and longer to fill. Thomas knew the signs. The underground spring that fed it was drying up under the relentless summer sun. For a week, he tried to ignore it, rationing the water, hauling extra buckets from a small creek a mile away, an exhausting, time-consuming task. But the creek was shrinking too, and the water level in the well dropped daily, a clear and unforgiving measure of his dwindling hopes. The breaking point came when his horse, his only animal of real value, refused to drink the silty water he offered. The animal was the engine of his farm. Without it, he was truly lost. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his stoic resignation. Digging a new well was an impossible expense. It required equipment he didn't have and manpower he couldn't afford. He spent a full day trying to deepen the existing well by hand, a fool's errand that left him covered in mud, his muscles screaming in protest, with nothing to show for it but a deeper hole of despair. He was a proud man, and his pride was a stubborn, thorny thing. He would not ask for help. He would not go to Mrs. Lee with his hand out, proving the town's gossip right, confirming that he was nothing more than a beggar seeking a benefactor. He would handle it himself, even if it meant ruin. But the town, for all its cruelty, was also a place where news traveled fast. Samuel, Mrs. Lee's hired hand, heard of Thomas's plight from the blacksmith. That evening, as Thomas sat on his porch, staring at his failing land in the fading light, 2 men he barely knew rode up the path. They were laborers from a larger ranch to the north. "Mr. Alden," one of them said, tipping his hat, "we're here about the well." Thomas stood up slowly, his body stiff with suspicion. "I didn't send for anyone." "No, sir," the man said. "Mrs. Lee did. She's contracted us for a new drilling. Says she's looking to invest in some of the local farms. A business proposition, she called it. Said she'd take her payment out of next year's crop yield at a fair rate." Thomas stared at them, the words taking a moment to sink in. A business proposition. Not charity, not a gift, an investment. It was a construction of language so precise, so perfectly designed to circumvent his pride, that he could only marvel at its quiet brilliance. She had found the one way to help him that he might be able to accept. She was not saving him. She was partnering with him. She was betting on his ability to succeed, on the future of his land. It was an act of profound respect. He looked from the men to the darkening fields, the land that had nearly broken him, and felt a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. "All right," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. Tell her thank you." The men nodded and said they would begin at first light. As they rode away, Thomas remained standing on the porch, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. For the first time in 5 years, the future did not feel like a threat, but like a possibility. The sound of the well drillers became the new rhythm of the farm for the next few days, a percussive, hopeful beat that replaced the oppressive silence. Thomas worked alongside the men, his own labor feeling purposeful again, part of a constructive effort rather than a desperate struggle against decline. Water, clean and cold and abundant, was struck on the 3rd day. The moment the first clear gush spilled onto the parched earth, a collective cheer went up from the men. Thomas simply stood and watched, the sight of it washing away years of accumulated anxiety. That evening he rode to Mrs. Lee's house. He didn't wait for an invitation. He found her in her garden, tending to a bed of late-blooming roses, her hands protected by thin leather gloves. The setting sun bathed the garden in a soft, forgiving light. She looked up as he approached, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. "The men said you found water," she said, her voice calm. "I did," he replied. He stopped a few feet from her, feeling the familiar awkwardness return, the chasm of their different worlds seeming to open up between them again. "I came to thank you, and to tell you I will honor our agreement. You'll have your share of the crop." "I have no doubt of that, mister." "Alden," she said, turning her attention back to her rose bush, snipping away a withered leaf. He stood there, knowing he should say more, that a simple thank you was not enough for what she had done. He was a man of few words, and the ones he needed now were buried deep. He looked at her hands, so delicate even in her work gloves, and thought of his own, calloused and scarred. He thought of her quiet house, and his own, filled with the ghosts of a life that was gone. "Why did you do it?" he asked, the question coming out more abruptly than he intended. She paused, her hand hovering over a perfect, deep red bloom. She looked at him, her gaze direct and stripped of all pretense. "When my husband died," she began, her voice losing some of its serene detachment, becoming softer, more vulnerable, "I was left with a great deal of money and a great deal of silence. The money is useful, but the silence is a heavy thing to carry alone." She turned to face him fully. "You seem to be a man who understands the weight of silence." He swallowed, the truth of her words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. She saw him. She did not see the poor farmer or the town spectacle. She saw the core of his grief, the solitude that had defined him for 5 long years. In that moment of shared understanding, the last of his prideful defenses crumbled. "My wife, Mary," he said, his voice raspy. "She loved roses. She tried to grow them here, but the soil is too hard. The water was never enough." It was the most he had ever shared with anyone about his wife, a small, precious memory offered up like a fragile gift. Mrs. Lee's expression softened, a deep, empathetic warmth blooming in her eyes. "Perhaps," she said gently, "the soil is not too hard. Perhaps it just needed a deeper well." They stood in the garden as the light faded, the air cooling around them, thick with the scent of roses and damp earth. The silence that fell between them now was no longer a void, but a space of communion. It was filled with the things they had finally said, and the many more things they now understood without needing to speak. Thomas looked around at the meticulously tended garden, a vibrant oasis carved out of the harsh landscape, and he saw it for what it was, an act of defiance, a testament to one woman's refusal to be buried by grief or circumstance. It was a reflection of her own quiet, unyielding strength. He thought of his own farm, of the stubborn, rocky fields he fought with every day, and saw it differently too. It was not just a symbol of his hardship, but also of his endurance. They were two survivors, each tending their own difficult patch of ground. "My husband was a good man," Mrs. Lee said, her voice a low murmur in the twilight. "He was ambitious and clever, but he was also kind. He built this house to be a sanctuary for me, a place where the world could not touch me. But after he was gone, the sanctuary became a cage." Thomas could understand that. His own home, once filled with Mary's warmth, had become a hollow shell, its walls echoing with memories that were both a comfort and a constant aching pain. He had locked himself inside with his grief, believing it was the only way to honor her, to keep her memory pure. But seeing Mrs. Lee, seeing the way she had carefully, deliberately begun to reach out, to build a new kind of life, made him question his own long isolation. Maybe honoring the past didn't mean being imprisoned by it. "I used to think I had to do it all alone," he confessed, his gaze fixed on a distant peak silhouetted against the last glow of the sun. "I thought that was what strength was, taking the weight of it all on your own shoulders." "And is it?" she asked softly. He thought of the well drillers, of the gush of clean water, of the shared meal in her home, of this very moment, standing in her garden. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." He finally turned to look at her, really look at her, not as the rich widow or the town mystery, but as the woman who had seen his need and met it with dignity, who had recognized his silence because she spoke its language. He saw the strength in her, but he also saw the loneliness, the same deep ache that resided in his own heart. Her initial question, the one that had so shocked him in the general store weeks ago, no longer seemed ludicrous or insulting. It seemed brave. It was the question of a woman who had decided she would not let the silence win. He took a half step closer, a small movement that closed the respectable distance between them. The air grew still, charged with a new and delicate intensity. He had come here to give her an answer to a business proposition, but he realized now that the original question was still hanging between them, waiting. He had no grand words, no poetic declarations. He was a man of the earth, and his feelings were as plain and solid as the ground beneath his feet. He simply reached out and took her hand. Her gloved fingers were small in his, but her grip was firm, steady. He looked into her eyes and gave her the only answer that mattered. It was a simple, solemn nod. A beginning.